We gave birth to a new generation, American, broader than lost gold, never touched, hidden inside the Puerto Rican mountains. We gave birth to a new generation, American. It includes everything imaginable. You name it, we got it, society. We gave birth to a new generation, American salutes all folklores, European, Indian, Black, Spanish, and anything else compatible. American singing to composer Pedro Flores, palm trees up high in the universal sky. American, sweet, soft Spanish danzas, gypsies, moving lyrics, La Española, cascabelling presence always singing at our side. American beating Jibaro modern troubadours, crying guitars, romantic continental bolero love songs. American across, forth and across, back, back across and forth back, forth across and back and forth, our trips, our walking bridges. It all dissolved into itself. An attempt was truly made. The attempt was truly absorbed, digested. We spit out the poison. We spit out in malice. We stand affirmative in action to reproduce a broader answer to the marginality that gobbled us up abruptly. American walking plena rhythms in New York, strutting beautifully, alert, alive, many turning eyes, wondering, admiring. American defining myself my own way, anyway, many ways, am-e-rican with the big R and the accent on the I. American like the soul gliding talk of gospel boogie music. American speaking new words in Spanglish tenements. Fast tongue moving street corner. Que corta. Talk being invented at the insistence of a smile. American abounding inside so many ethnic English people, and out of humanity we blend and mix all that is good. American integrating in New York and defining our own destino, our own way of life. American defining the new America, humane America, admired America, loved America, harmonious America, the world in peace. Our energies collectively invested to find other civilizations to touch God further and further, to dwell in the spirit of divinity. American, yes, for now, for I love this, my second land, and I dream to take the accent from the altercation and be proud to call myself American. In the U.S., sense of the word, American, America. American, a poem by Tato Liviera from the book Benediction, the Complete Poetry of Tato Liviera. Good evening, my name is Charles Carr, and I'm the host of Philly Loves Poetry, which is a collaborative program between the Moonstone Art Center of Philadelphia and PhillyCAM. The focus of our program on Philly Loves Poetry is to give our audience the experience of the rich and diverse culture of poetry in the city of Philadelphia, and to let our audience understand there are over 50 organizations that in one way or another promote the love of poetry in the city, either by sponsoring poetry readings, having special poetry events throughout the year, publishing books of poems, as well as reviews of poems, both online and in writing, and giving us a very diverse selection of poetry to appreciate in this city. So tonight, and speaking to the diversity of poetry in the Philadelphia, the theme of our program tonight is Puerto Rican poetry in Philadelphia. Philly loves Puerto Rican poetry, and we have two marvelous examples of Puerto Rican poetry in the city of Philadelphia. First, Nick López. Nick is a Philadelphia-based Boricua poet, writer, and DJ. Their poems have been described as an eclectic blend of Spanglish, hip-hop rhythms, and Puerto Rican jabiera, bred in the swamplands of Florida. They are a 2012 Levi Foundation Arts and Change Grant recipient and hold an MFA in creative writing from Rutgers, Newark. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And next is Angel Isián. Angel is a Puerto Rican writer born in the Bronx and raised in Santa Isabela, Salinas, Puerto Rico. Angel is the co-founder of La Liga de Poetas del Sur, the Southern League of Poets. He continues to promote the reading and writing of poetry from around the island through cultural activities, exchanges, festivals, readings, books, fairs, etc. Angel is the author of La Casa de las Espollas, The House of Mirrors. Co-edited and published a collection of queer poetry, Cuerpos en la Pared, Bodies on the Wall. Co-founded Icon, dedicated to publishing Puerto Rican speculative fiction, and edited first anthology of Puerto Rican horror, No cierres los ojos, Antología de Relatos de Hora y Terror, Don't Close Your Eyes, an anthology of tales of horror and terror. Since founding Icon, Angel has continued to write and edit fiction and poetry, giving workshops on creative writing and labor in the production of future publications for Icon. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to say, when we think of Puerto Ricans in Philadelphia, Puerto Ricans, or people who declare themselves as Puerto Ricans, are 8% of the population of Philadelphia. One of the largest ethnic groups, 122,000 people, based on the 2010 census. And in 2012, the census had 91,527. I only say that because it's obvious that the Puerto Rican population in Philadelphia continues to grow. And we're very happy with that because I think they bring that richness to the fabric of Philadelphia. So speaking of Puerto Rican poetry in Philadelphia, can you describe the poetry scene in Philadelphia for our audience? Because I really think it is important that people understand, where Puerto Rican poetry happens in this city and what are the forces that shape it.
Yeah, I think being somebody that's been in the Philadelphia area for about 12 years, one of the things that I've noticed with the Puerto Rican poetry scene is how much it fluctuates and how transformative it is, depending on what is sort of occurring in the city of Philadelphia. Philadelphia has a long poetic history, has a large poetry scene as it is, and I think the Puerto Rican poetry scene functions in sort of the same way that the city of Philadelphia functions. One of the first things that I learned and that I heard as described of the city of Philadelphia is that it's the city of neighborhoods. So just like there's not one distinct sort of culture of Philadelphia, depending on where you're at, if you're in West Philly or in South Philly or Port Richmond, you get a sort of a distinct culture and rhythm and language to it. I find that very much to be true with the Puerto Rican poetry scene. It's diverse, it's vibrant, it's sort of a mixture of various individuals depending on the region that they're in. But there's sort of a resiliency to how Puerto Rican poetry shows up in sort of the Philadelphia literary scene. In comparison to sort of its counterparts like New York City, right? And you sort of hear automatically, you think of sort of the New Yorican poetry scene. There's a Philly Rican scene. And I think it's very much driven by individuals. There's a sense of community. So one of the things that I've known is it doesn't matter how long you've been doing poetry in the city. You could be a new writer, you can be an old writer. There's always a sense of just unconditional love. So somebody will know somebody to get you on an open mic, or they'll know somebody else to have you come out and do a reading. And that's sort of type of community that it doesn't matter how long you've been in the city. There is sort of that undoubtable support that you'll receive from Puerto Rican poets.
Mm-hmm. Angel, you're a somewhat recent arrival in Philadelphia, and you're trying to kind of find your way through Puerto Rican culture, because you're not only a poet, but you're a novelist, a horror story writer, etc. So you've been here how long?
I've been here for 8 months now, 9 months.
Okay, and what brought you to Philadelphia?
Well, I came to Philadelphia because I was in Puerto Rico when Hurricane Maria hit, and needless to say, it was a tough situation for a lot of people, including myself and my partner. And after the difficulties of living on the island post Maria, and finding that the situation didn't seem like it was going to get much better, we had already previously talked about moving to the mainland, and I guess Maria kind of forced us to leave sooner than we expected to. We had a lot of projects that we were working on at the time, especially with the founding of ACON, but a lot of those projects were put on hold because of the situation, and so we were kind of forced to drop everything and leave. And we decided for Philly ultimately because we did have a friend that was going through different cities and looking around, and he recommended Philly. But one of the other things is that we had family in close by, especially I have family that's lived in Philly for a long, long time, and I always wanted to kind of connect with that side of the family as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's important to say that, talking about connections, that you two are on this program because you were referred by Raquel Salas Rivera, our current Poet Laureate of Philadelphia.
That's right.
So how did you make that connection? You've been here 8 months, so that's very impressive that you made a connection where she felt good that she wanted to recommend you for this program.
One of the things that about the writing community in general in Puerto Rico, and especially the poetry community, is that it's really close-knit. It's very tightly knit. If you know one person, it won't take too long before you know everybody around. And so when I decided to come to Philly, a lot of my writer friends had already knew Raquel personally, and they had worked with her, with them. As soon as I decided to move to Philly, one of my close friends, who's also a poet and a novelist, David Caleb Acevedo, and Cindy Jimenez, who's also a poet, she recommended contacting Raquel. And so I did. I contacted them, and on my first week here in Philly, they invited us over for dinner, and we've been good friends since.
That's wonderful. Well, you said you've been here for 12 years. Can you speak of, where were you before that 12 years?
Yeah.
And, what brought you to this area?
Yeah, so I was born in Rio Piedras, Puerto Rico, and my family, the majority of my family still is within Caguas, and but my immediate family on my mother's side, the majority of us ended up migrating to Florida in the 90s. So I grew up in Florida, which was a very interesting experience at that time. Very much was sort of a Jim Crow South, and here, I grew up in a small town called Holly Hill, and where folks would ask questions like, where in Mexico is Puerto Rico? So there was no sort of understanding or distinction of what it meant to be Puerto Rican. I ended up actually coming to the Philadelphia area because I had to escape Florida. I say that I literally fled Florida, and ended up going to do my undergraduate at Bryn Mawr College, which is about 30 minutes outside of Philly. And I fell in love with the city. One of the reasons why I stayed at Bryn Mawr was its proximity to a major sort of metropolitan city. And I was very much drawn to the spirit that I noticed in Philadelphia, that it's known as sort of the city of underdogs. But that underdog spirit is that resilient spirit that I find so much in my own work, in my own sort of upbringing, and also just my own Puerto Rican identity, that idea of resilience. And I stayed. Even though I left to do my MFA, and I was convinced that I would sort of lived the New York City dream, I felt like I wanted to come back home. And it was sort of in that moment was sort of the first time for me that Philadelphia felt like home. And I have found that Philly feels like a home for a lot of folks who are in transit.
Right. So if there was a young person or even an old person sitting out or viewing this program says, well, geez, where does Puerto Rican poetry happen? I would really like to get more involved in it. I would really like to find out, what defines that. What would you recommend?
I think one of the biggest locations that pops in my head is Tayel Puertorriqueño. So Tayel Puertorriqueño just now recently opened up about 2 years ago their new sort of cultural center.
Right.
It's beautiful, the space. And so really being dedicated to Puerto Rican arts, and Carmen, the executive director, they've done a fantastic job in just bringing a diversity of Puerto Rican art at Tayel. In terms of finding the spot for Puerto Rican poets, I think that's what makes it unique about Philadelphia is that Puerto Rican poets are sort of sprinkled within all of the poetry community scenes. I don't see there being the distinctive centralized unit, but that there are individual poets who build community and will put on events when the need to feel connected to community happens. So I think of, for example, the Philly for Puerto Rico poetry event that took place in December, which was organized by Denise Froem, who's another Puerto Rican poet, brought in poets, Puerto Rican poets from out of town, highlighted Puerto Rican poets here in Philly, and that was a beautiful event. So I find that much sort of how Angel met Raquel, that's how sort of the scene is in Philadelphia.
Yeah, okay. So I haven't had the opportunity to read poetry from either of you in advance of this program, but could you tell us, or how did you come to poetry? What are the forces that really kind of shaped your movement in poetry? And where are you right now in that journey?
Well, I have a long history with poetry. It goes all the way back to my grade school years. I remember one of my English teachers back there assigned some poems by Edgar Allan Poe. It was the first time that I encountered that poetry, and I fell in love with it immediately. And I kind of just wanted to imitate what I saw Poe doing in his poetry, and started writing there. And then I could never stop. Like I just continued writing on and on. And later on, I had some wonderful Spanish teachers in high school that helped me get familiar with, female Latin American poets, and I saw so much power in that poetry. So it kind of helped me to want to explore poetry in Spanish, because I lived in Connecticut when I was younger. So for the longest time, I assumed English as more of my main language than Spanish. And then in my high school years, I found more beauty in writing poetry in the Spanish language, and so there was a shift there. And I wrote a lot of poetry. Most of it, obviously, as a teenager, was more geared towards whoever I was in love with at the time. But when I started college, I did some college in BYU in Utah, and then I moved back to Puerto Rico and went to the Inter-American University in Guayama. And there I met this lady called Nora Cruz. And while I was in college, my first few years I kind of had stopped writing for a little bit because I was so busy. And Nora Cruz is kind of like this grand presence of a lady. She's pretty much like a Puerto Rican cultural ambassador, always representing the town of Guayama. She works with poetry, she works with Puerto Rican folkloric music, she works with bomba, which is a Puerto Rican music style. And she works with the type of drums and dancing that goes along with it. And she's traveled around the world to different countries to kind of take that that wonderful Puerto Rican cultural experience. And she wanted to work with a group of poets in Guayama. And so she put an ad in the newspaper, and I remembered her, so I from seeing her shows and whatnot. So I went over to the meeting, the first meeting that they had, and it was just a group of people from Guayama that wanted to read to each other poetry, and that's how it started. And then it just kind of became this movement of poetry since 2009 all the way to today. It still functions, La Liga de Poetas del Sur. And working in La Liga kind of forced me to view poetry in different ways, listening to what others were writing, understanding how I could refine my poetry a little better, and look in different directions. And so also while in college, I had this kind of period where I felt extremely lonely, and I became really introspective. And so my poetry kind of started reflecting that, more introspection and that kind of thing. I also started writing things that were more political as well. Through that, when I wanted to kind of gather a group of poems and kind of expose myself to the world, that was in 2013. I published my first book, and I kind of wanted to get familiar with the rest of the Puerto Rican writing movement. So I started going to different open mics around the island, and I met tons of great poets at the time, and they kind of formed what I write today.
Wow, thank you very much. Nick, how about you? I mean, what are the kind of forces, and maybe it's not a force, but what brings you to poetry?
Yeah. So one of the things that I say sometimes is that I am a Puerto Rican that grew up a Florida Rican that wanted to be a New Yorican, and I ended up as a Philly Rican. That's sort of my work. I think feels most informed by this beautiful poem that you read earlier, the American diaspora, in the Puerto Rican diaspora. I came into poetry very much at a young age, which I think most poets do. I think as a poet in general, you don't really know when was the moment that you fell in love with poetry. You just remember always writing poetry. But for me, what was transformative was my introduction to the New Yorican poetry movement. So the first book that I received with full Puerto Rican poets as well as New Yorican poets was an anthology entitled Aloud Voices from the New Yorican Poetry Cafe. And that was transformative for me because when I got more serious with my poetry writing, I found, as in many sort of writers and many writers of color sort of experience, that sort of marginalization. We don't see ourselves reflected in the canon of poetry. I certainly didn't see Puerto Rican poets in my high school classes. So I was really searching for folks that looked like me, that talked about my experiences, that read poetry in the way that I read it and felt poetry in the way that I felt it. I find that poetry is intimate. It's an intimate experience. So much of my Puerto Rican identity growing up in the South was in the intimacy of my home. So I spoke Spanish at home. Our cultural sort of gatherings always happen at home. So at home is where I really developed my poetic voice. And I was influenced by the New Yorican movement because it was very much reflecting what I was experiencing growing up in a place where I didn't see a community like me. So in much ways, I think my poems now are still very much in conversation with those New Yorican poets. And I think also being a writer, being a queer writer, is expanding those conversations a bit more.
Okay. So, we've had the modern, what we'll call now the existential dilemma of Puerto Rico, following the Maria, which brought you to Philadelphia. But Puerto Rican poetry has seemed grown up around a variety of crises and moments like that. Colonization, different events around that, from time to time. So I'm just focusing on, what is happening right now in Puerto Rico. Because we, sit here in the United States, we who look to our Puerto Rico and look to the people of Puerto Ricans as our brothers and sisters. And so we're concerned when we've not seen the kind of response to the recovery in Puerto Rico that we would hope for. So can you speak to that? Is your poetry beginning to address that, at all, that this new crisis of the island?
Well, I have not yet decided to write upon the situation, of what's going on in Puerto Rico right now. The main reason for that is that for me, like, the situation is so near still. Like, I remember leaving Puerto Rico pretty distressed about how the situation was, pretty frustrated, and for a lot of the writers back at home that I know that they began to write immediately about their experiences, and it did reflect and affect a lot of what they're writing. In fact, some of my friends have sent me some of their writings, and it really ties in directly to what's going on. And I've seen friends that have published already books that deal with the aftermath and the situation and the stories and the experiences. And the way I see it, it's a sort of cry of like desperation, because a lot of people there feel like they have their hand tied. It's like there's this sense of like, what can we do, to get some type of justice for what happened and what has happened afterwards. In my case, like, it was a little bit more difficult. Like, I felt like I didn't want to write about it. I just wanted to escape it. And so I know that in time I will reflect upon it, and I will go back to it, and it will in some way or another affect what I write about. But as of today, like, I've been so focused on just kind of rebuilding a life somewhere else that
Sure.
I have not even wanted to try.
Right. How about you, Nick?
Yeah, I think that the Puerto Rican writer is a writer always in an existential crisis. And I say that jokingly, but I say that
true.
within the history of Puerto Rico is still a colony.
Mm-hmm.
Puerto Ricans have experienced colonialization and sort of the existential crisis that colonialization enforces by its history between Puerto Ricans on the island versus Puerto Ricans on the mainland versus larger diasporic Puerto Ricans. Why Puerto Ricans choose to leave the island is very much tied to colonialism. How Puerto Ricans are racialized within the United States is as a result of colonialization. So I think that Maria perhaps exacerbated the notion of, I think for Puerto Ricans, or at least the Puerto Ricans I spoke to, but I think Puerto Ricans were always just like, this has always been the case, right? This is not new. I think what Maria did was shown the world what colonialism looks like in 2018, from just the devastation that occurred to the United States administration post-Maria looked like. I think that it sort of highlighted that these are people, this is still a colony, and this is not working for the island. The plus side of that, I think what it's done is it has propelled many Puerto Ricans who either grew up on the mainland or came to the mainland. It has propelled them to come back to Puerto Rico. And so I have seen this energy and this reemergence and this sort of urgency for Puerto Ricans to, and especially young Puerto Ricans, to come back and bring back their art, bring back their culture, bring back their business, and really build a Puerto Rico that is, I think, once has been imagined. And that, to me, is what feels the most exciting about this period now. And I think devastation does that.
But it's not something new to the island. I mean, it's, as to your point, is, I guess a lot of people said, well, this is not a surprise. Not that a hurricane hit us, but, this crisis that we find us in and the response to, to this crisis from the mainland, as well as the response to the financial crisis, before that hit. So having said that, we would love to hear your poems. So the floor is yours, starting with Nick. Read some of your poems.
Right.
And if you want to, talk about them, you're free to do that.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking about what pieces or what poems I've been drawn to lately. And so I think I have a handful of poems that have marked, I would say, probably my own considerations post-Maria. This poem is entitled Survivor's Guilt. Feels like a full moon, my heart a wild throat shouting at the sky, my own echo coming back, a lullaby of my own awakening, a wolf howling with a moonlit pen, me too. God bless the rage in us all. Sycorax's son. This time he sat on a cliff overlooking the Pacific and wrote all 33 lines of his poem in one breath. He began naturally with the hardest part. I lost my beloved. The line reminded him of rice softening in simmering water before fresh onions were sliced, when his hands would touch her shoulder, glide through her hair, heavy like a poet's. In scattering ashes, the soul in its flight, he saw at the edge of the gray continent where his pen pressed hard against the sheer size of the dark Pacific. His tongue now remembered the wounded flavor, the flawless salt of those lips. Only here can we truly write, he thought. At the beautiful edge between water and earth we call life. For when a white rose appeared in the salt foam sliding down the face of falling rocks, he stopped and slowly repeated, that is love. That is love. That is love. Like the earth, we too unfold in unafraid moments toward the ocean. One of the things that I love about being Puerto Rican is being Puerto Rican, but also New Yorkers, is that New Yorkers are the founder of salsa music. Salsa music came about in New York City, and salsa music was influential in my home. And I very much read poetry and listen to poetry very much in the way that I hear music and I hear salsa. And I think that if you take some time to listen to some classic salseros, the lyrics of salsa music are very poetic. So I feel some of my founding introductions to poetry were from salsa music as well. So this poem is sort of an ode to salsa music, and more specifically, it's an image of watching my grandmother, who at 84 years old, at her birthday, somehow got the energy to start dancing salsa out of nowhere, and just to sort of see, oh my goodness, this was my grandmother when she was younger, and salsa sort of having the power to do that. Few basic steps of salsa. Step. Hips veering about in a warm fluid of youth, you clack your heels and swing your pretty ribs in gallant yaw. The gorgeous frill of your red dress flapping over ankle, that tuck and the slit. Rosy and bulky were the kinks that came down and melted off muscles from your thigh. Patient as a corpse, you slither and pop, aiming the ball of your foot down and dipping into a sleek, neat coil, snapping back into stiff spine, fingers skewed along the skinny gash of your garb. You are stealing the eyes while batting your body in cute frolic. Transfer. You dance with a young, thirsty bullet, waiting in the distance. He slides between your legs, gallant in your matchless stride. You glide in the ghost of a young girl dream, remembering how desperately you wanted to be woman, how desperately you wanted to be desired, sweet off-beated plie, distant eyes climbing you as you gather your dress away from the machine of your legs. There is a special slowing of your soul now, balanced and cool, reminiscing, salt on pleasing, the nimble tender bone of wanting. Your hips slide in his palm like chocolate. His eyes are cuffs. You believe in death and life as one coexistence. Change. In mature age, you are still fruit giggling, dazzling the new shutter of my camera, fingers twisted in young nostalgia, remembering the many cocktails awarded to you, lounging in that young girl dream, bubbling like a catalog of goosebumps lining the arms of a child, naked in a black newborn autumn's wind. You are remembering the clack your heels once bestowed, how you used to step in and out of form, feeling the spaces where the wood would mourn you, obey your return, thrilled as you danced yourself out of your body and onto the shoulders of night like a shawl.
That's beautiful.
I'm one poet that I will proudly proclaim as being a diasporic Puerto Rican, really to sort of highlight that I think now we're reaching that there are more Puerto Ricans that live in the United States on the mainland that there are actually on the island. And sort of, I've had a lot of ponderations and consideration, what does that mean for Puerto Ricans who do not live on the island, but sort of carry the island with them. So these are all to my diasporic Puerto Ricans. A diasporic Puerto Rican love lesson. On the night of my 30th birthday, I dreamt of a woman stepping out of the ocean, wearing every starfish at once like armor. Her eyes crystallized the liquor of the seed planted in her vision, an island pronounced by the ocean without bubbles, left alone to defy the heat and storms. Encanto, the people called it. She cuts her destiny in two and keeps the heavier one. When my mother was 30 years old, she fled Puerto Rico and for years refused to tell me the story of why. Perhaps she thought she was saving me. I come from a fleeing people, first land, then language. I have always desired to speak Spanish without shame, guilt, or resentment, desire to speak English like a poet, because it feels like from either side, you cannot win. You cannot convince them of your innocence in that process of flight as a child with my mother, and as an adult I have made by myself. Children of the diaspora learn quietly survival language people in our old homes hate without thought and love without self-pride. There is no room to say yes or no, because you've been told by family you are no longer really, in all honesty, a true Puerto Rican. Tú eres de allá, una gringa, una New Yorican. So you scream back in the language that you're still learning, spitting in the eye of the world. Yo no vine a matar a nadie, yo vine a morir. Yo la conciencia de Puerto Rico, yo la conciencia de Puerto Rico, yo la conciencia de Puerto Rico. Children of the diaspora, is the love for Borinquen always the heaviest half, never having the answers to the nightmare questions of our genesis, the only choice but to be survivors despite the fear still being there, an enduring storm called Maria. Did they name her Maria for sea of bitterness or sea of sorrow? Or is it the rebellion or the wished-for child? Is she the lady of the sea or the pronounced devastation, so that we may endure once again the grief in order to start anew? Like my mother at 30, who made the decision for fight or flight in order to start anew. We learn to live with the language of these contradictions. These are the profound costs of just being us. Diasporic Puerto Ricans, always believing the possibilities before they are wiped out. Like how I love you. hoping not for return or recovery, but for a perpetual renewal of that enduring spirit that gives us the courage to fight or fly.
Thank you very much. They were just wonderful, remarkable poems. So, Angel, will you share your poems with us and with our audience?
Yes, of course. I have a few things that I want to share. I do want to remark though that most of my poetry is in Spanish, so I worked on some translations for the program tonight. So I'm going to take a cue from Raquel. I'm going to read one in Spanish and then read it again in English, just so because I have more confidence in the Spanish version than the English version. So the first one in Spanish is called Psicofonía, and it says like this. Muestra el espejo una antorcha encendida que en mis pupilas resplandece y una caverna tenebrosa como el pozo del olvido que la humanidad merece. El universo en mosaico enterrado entre los alaridos de mi pensamiento con la armonía de mil canciones que conglomera el tono de mi sufrimiento. Ahí veo que juego al bueno, vestido de malo, bebiendo del héroe y el villano, con el cañón del purgatorio que va disparando miseria desde una mano, y la pluma de los cielos que con la otra va escribiendo su obra en delicia, mientras mi cabeza se sumerge en el estuario de la inocencia y la malicia. Me muestra la galería picatesca de tantas desrazones abandonadas al lienzo, el lufre de mil reliquias del pasado conservándose para un nuevo comienzo. Ahí mis obras se pintaron, se esculpieron y labraron en fragmentos de memorias, mientras el espejo contaba sin vergüenza las quijotadas de mis ocultas historias. Y se dijo que mis rostros eran tan variados como los de Belmes de la Moraleda, donde impuse mi presencia misteriosa hasta desaparecer por desconocida vereda, mirando con tantos ojos que me quedaba ciego buscando una verdad que no existe y hablando con tantas bocas que mi aliento desnudó al viento de la mentira que lo viste. Muestra el espejo un castillo construido a medias en espera de ser completado. Sus murallas góticas a los horizontes del sol poniente tornan ansiosas su mirada. Sus columnas clásicas sostienen un balcón barroco que espera la madrugada. Y al crepúsculo, la puerta neoclásica se abre a la compañía de una solitaria velada. Los jardines llevan tulipanes sin abrir, frescas de primaveras que rehúsan irse, y de rosas muertas de inviernos que de nuevos comienzos no logran vestirse. A los lúgubres pasillos el viento cuela la multitud de hojas secas del verano y pétalos de otoño que manchan la alcoba con musas marchitas de cantar en vano. Me muestra la encrucijada de mil caminos redimidas bajo la pisada de un nuevo caminante, un laberinto esférico que se ha perdido en sí mismo buscando hallarse en otro semblante. Veo que hay un ser que se oscurece y se desluce como si compuesto por madrugadas y una sombra en busca de su persona que susurra en mil voces sus psicofonías desesperadas. Perdóname, espejo, por no pedir perdón ni rogar expiación por mi castillo inconcluso, si mis bocas son muchas, cargadas de sombras y luces y con cada rostro confuso, y si mis tantos ojos no logran verse en ti, por justo o por impío, ángel, hombre, santo y pagano, perdón si no queda más que saber que soy todos y todo, nadie y nada, un ser humano. So I'm going to read the translation now.
Okay.
Okay, in English, the title would be Psychophony, and it says, "The mirror reveals a fiery torch that glows within my eyes, and a gloomy cave like the well of oblivion that humanity has earned, the universe like a mosaic buried amid the wailings of my thoughts, with the harmony of 1,000 songs crowding the sounds of my woe. There I've played the role of good in evil's garb, drinking from hero and from foe, with hell's cannon blasting misery from one of my arms and heaven's plume on the other, composing the sweetest of tunes, just as my head sinks into the cove of virtue and vice. It shows me the picturesque gallery of so many insanities abandoned upon the cloth, the Louvre of 1,000 relics of the past, being preserved and kept for a new start, There my works were painted in fragments of thoughts, as the mirror shamelessly told of the quixotic ordeals of my hidden tales. And it was said that my faces were as diverse as those from Belmes de la Moraleda, where once I forced my eerie presence, until I vanished by way of an unknown trail, glaring with so many eyes that I became blind, seeking for a truth that was never there, and speaking out of so many mouths that my breath undressed the wind of the lies that it wears. The mirror reveals a castle half built, awaiting the day of its completion. Its Gothic walls anxiously turn their gaze to horizons of the setting sun. Its classical columns hold up a Baroque balcony, hoping for the coming dawn, and to every twilight the neoclassical door opens itself to the company of a lonely night. The gardens are lush with unopened tulips, fresh from springs that ever wish to remain, and of roses dead of winters that can never again be garbed with the dress of rebirth. Through the melancholy halls blow the wind a multitude of summer-dried leaves and of autumn petals that stain the rooms with muses withered from casting their song in vain. It shows me the crossroads of a thousand paths, redeemed under the step of a new traveler, a spherical maze lost within itself while seeking to find itself upon another face. I see a being shine and darken as if made of mornings and midnights, and a shadow looking for its person, whispering in a thousand voices its desperate psychophonies. Forgive me, mirror, for I refuse to beg your pardon, nor can I pray for atonement on behalf of my unfinished castle. If my mouths are so many, bearing their shadows and lights, with each of its bewildered faces, and if my all too many eyes can never see themselves in you, for being just or ungodly, angel, man, sinner, or saint, forgive me then, if I have nothing left but to know that I am everyone and everything, none of them and nothing, a human heart. And I think I'll read one more poem. This was a poem that I did write in English. It was a sort of kind of like a cry for the Orlando massacre. As you know, a lot of our Latino and specifically Puerto Rican brothers and sisters, as well as others, were slain during that time. And I was actually celebrating Pride with friends in one of the places where in Puerto Rico we tend to celebrate Pride, which is Boquerón. And the news came as we were celebrating Pride over there, and it was something shocking and something that really left us scarred. So when I went back home that night, I sat down and I wrote this poem in English. And it was pretty much left alone. I've never really touched it. I kind of just left it as is, but I kind of want to share with that tonight. It's called The Reveler's Final Dance. Their pulse was strong when it began, hearts pounding to soulful salsa beats, songs of fun and senseless things, songs of love and broken wings. A merengue's rapid twist and churns would mark the pace of dreams of beer and rum and some tequila too. A sad bachata couldn't dampen the laughter of the reveling throng, the happy laughter of God's rejected sons, of Allah's hated daughters, the sinful children, the beautiful revelers, the light-filled creatures of the dark. Look at them move across the salon, hear them sing and make fun of the bitter world of Bibles and guns, of Qurans and pistols and knives. Perhaps their dance was too much. Much of ease, much of freedom. For the one that lurks behind the moon, before the sun, the broken and misguided son. I feel their joy, their sadness crawl upon these walls. As a text or two escape the chaos of their sweaty palms, a selfie crosses the infinite cosmos that fill the cyber souls that love. In the age of iPhones, Androids, and apps, there are painful memories, the final witnesses of words and faces stored in servers and hard disk and clouds. Who could have guessed that the dance of the revelers would later become the feast of the reaper's bloody ball, the red death without a mask? They could not tell. For all they knew was that they loved, or longed to love, or longed to be loved, or wanted, or lusted. Perhaps they settled to be accepted or respected. Not even in this, their barricade of song and sex and laughter, this, the last frontier, the final sanctuary defiled by the unholy man's contempt. And so it came to pass that the temple built against the god of hate, the so-called savior of those who loved their chains, was brought to ruin as they danced. Oh, their soul-sweet final dance. The tropical rhythm drumming strong, the banging of the killer's gun, the strumming of the mournful drum, and the panic and the fear that pierced right through, as the bullets would do too. And as the shattered glass would finally break the forgotten liquor spill, and the veins of endless minutes fill the drunken nightmare of this foolish servant of fictitious lore. Oh, the yearning for a paradise was far too much to ask, for the revelers would ever be denied a palace by Alice Keep or Elohim streets of gold, or so it was perceived. I do not know, or perhaps I know too well the cries that called for mama's help, the final wish for lover's arms, the child that saw the sacrifice of the guardian that took upon her breast the bullet for her offspring's life, and gave her blood once more, and gave her flesh once more, to give the world at least one final birth. The rest is rushed with red and fury, but also with the blood, the revelers' blood and tears, the smell of salt and iron, the sounds of cries and shots, the sounds of fading music, the sounds of phones that rang in vain. Oh, the revelers. Somehow they seem to me to dance even today. And they stir the world somehow. They stir my soul with anger, with ire and sour anger, yes, but they stir me to the longing and tears, the silent tears of resolution, tears that want to bind such reckless repulsion, such lingering ignorance of this foolish, violent hate of those who do not know, the wisdom of a song, a poem, a tender act of love, a night at the club, an evening with friends, the kiss of two men, the passion of two females' lovers' touch, the drag queen's witty banter, the transition into accepted self, the fruitless pleasures of the night, the joy of being, the joy of existing, the joy of living, the joy of never caring for the commandments of gods or the judgments of men, or roles and rules and many other petty, plastic, prefabricated thoughts. The revelers danced. There was no meaning in that, I know. The revelers died. There was no meaning in that, I know. The revelers, they were the meaning, their dance, their lives, their souls, but nobody cared, but nobody saw until the revelers' final dance.
Wow.
Thank you.
Wow, that's gorgeous. Thank you. So, where's your poetry now? Where is your next? What is the next step for you as an artist and poets, both of you?
Well, I'm currently writing I've been writing this book for years. It's a book that I've been writing. It's also a sort of introspective journey as I've kind of been writing. I think that my poetry has transformed as I've been transformed, and in a way I've been transformed by my poetry and by the poets that I surround myself with. So it's kind of a journey, and so I am writing a book called El Bosque de los Árboles Torcidos, or the Forest of Twisted Trees, I guess. I've been working on that for some years, but I also am thinking of future projects that I want to work on, and see how my poetry changes now that I live here in Philly, and now that I am part of the Puerto Rican diaspora. How will that affect what I write? It's different when you write from the island, looking out and being in the immediate situation of being in that colonial system. And then when you come here, it's so different when you have to look at it from this perspective. So your role changes, and so I think that my role as a poet will change as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So I am currently attempting to finish my first manuscript of collection of poetry, tentatively entitled Bregando. And bregando means, in Spanish, and mostly Puerto Ricans use it, but it means to struggle. But it means to struggle with charm and witty sense of humor about that struggle. So bregando really is around sort of my obsessions with my own family's sort of history and migration, and particularly the women in my life. So looking at my grandmother's story to my mother's story of flight, and my own as flight, and sort of trying to piece our stories together. And the formatting was really actually inspired by another Puerto Rican writer, which I read her memoir. The author, her name is Irene Vilal, and she wrote this fantastic book called The Ladies Gallery. And she's actually the great-granddaughter of Lolita Lebron, who is a Puerto Rican independence revolutionary. And it sort of, in similar fashion, interrogated a lot of the questions of her own identity, having such a famous grandmother and sort of the disruptions and the trauma that occurred in her life. So I'm hoping to finish that up, but that's been a manuscript of poems that I worked on heavily for years, and then I put away in my drawer for years and didn't touch it, and now I just recently opened it up again and thinking about how sort of things are transforming. Now I think being a writer who is a Puerto Rican, having the inverse of Angel's experience, where now it's like that yearn to go back to the island. So I hope to do that.
So this month is Spanish Heritage Month. And of course in Philadelphia, it's celebrated, demonstratively by a parade, but is there something that you're doing? Is there something that groups of Puerto Ricans do outside of, major celebrations like that? I mean, do you really feel a sense of that, or it's just...
Spanish Heritage Month?
Yeah.
I think that it is a part of our identity, and I think that in a way, Puerto Ricans always have had an interesting relationship with the rest of Latin America. But when all is said and done, we share that common language and a fairly common history. So I think that for most Puerto Ricans, that is always something to celebrate. That Latinidad, that sense of community, and that we share some similar struggles. So I think that's always something to look forward to and celebrate, no matter what.
Yeah, what I see, from looking at from the outside, is a community that has intense pride
Yes.
in who they are,
Mm-hmm.
and in their language, and in their rituals, and in their culture. And that's one of the really fantastic things about Philadelphia, that we have an opportunity, to open ourselves up to this. This is a great thing about the city, that we should never deny that there's this richness, this fabric of all kinds of people that are, bringing these gifts to us. That's why it's somewhat troubling for someone who lives in a very diverse place like Philadelphia, that we're now faced with this crisis that you're not welcome. Not you, meaning Puerto Ricans, but you're not welcome. And I worry about that, and I think a lot of us should worry about that, and that we are forgetting, the richness that this has given us, the gifts that this has brought to our culture. And it's been a gift tonight to have both of you on the program, and I wish you much success.
Thank you.
In your future endeavors, and I want you to stay in touch with Moonstone Arts. We are a publisher of books and chapbooks and books of poems, so please keep us informed of what you're doing.
Absolutely.
Stay in touch with Moonstone. We have poetry readings every week at Fergie's and other venues throughout the city, and they're just amazing poets, that come through our portals, and you're two of the representatives of that. So once again, thank you so much, and I have to say thank you to Raquel.
Yes,
Yes.
thank you for that.
if you're watching, for referring these two wonderful poets to us, and we very much appreciated having you on.
Thank you. For
Thank you
having me.
so much.
So I want to say in closing, of course, thank you to this wonderful crew at PhillyCAM, who always makes this show possible and does so much to prepare for it. So thanks again to the whole crew here, and we look forward to seeing you next month on the first Tuesday of October.